Welcome to In Defense of the Revolution, a Cuba Solidarity podcast covering the history and politics of Cuba from a Canadian perspective. My name is Cam Scott, and I'm here with Robert Crooks and Samantha Hislop. We are going to be talking about the further escalations of the Trump administration against the Cuban people. It is only the third week of the Trump administration, and the barrage of insults and escalations continues apace. What are some of the recent developments on this front?
Well, a couple days ago, we're recording this on Friday the 14th, I believe it was on the 12th, Politico.com released an interview with Trump's special envoy to Latin America, Mauricio Claver-Carone. Typical of stuff coming out of the Trump administration, this interview is sort of batshit crazy, but scary as well. He says some pretty, seemingly delusional things about China, some things about Venezuela. But of course, when you have someone that high up in the power hierarchy who's saying delusional things, they have the potential to be very dangerous. And I think what caught a lot of people's eyes is what he said about Cuba. He said that change in Cuba is, quote, inevitable. When the interviewer asked him what kind of change, suggesting, did he mean regime change? Claver-Carone's response was democratic change. He says the Cuban model is obviously dead. That no other countries are saying, oh, I want to become like Cuba, which is funny because there are certain aspects of Cuban society that I would love for them to be duplicated in Canada. More than one, but one that comes off the top of my head is their medical system, but there's many other aspects of their society that are enviable.
I was just in Cuba, and I was at a conference of very, very many delegates from very many countries saying that they should like to be more like Cuba. Yeah,
absolutely, right? So, the interviewer goes on, so, what kind of change? Regime change? Claver-Carone says, well, democratic change. And then the interviewer says, well, what role can the Trump administration play in that change? And Claver-Carone's response was, quote, oh, I think we can be very creative. Very creative. What does that mean? I think we can be very creative, and I'll leave it at that. Any hints? I think it's rife with opportunities and creativity. So, very vague, but disconcerting to say the least. And I think that some of the stuff that we'll talk about later is going to, I think, reveal a little bit of insight into what that, quote, creativity might be. But I wanted to do a little bit of background on who Mauricio Claver-Carone is, because he actually has a quite a long history in Washington and Florida in sort of anti-Cuba activities. He sort of first started popping up, it seems like, around the Elian Gonzalez saga, where he was fighting very strong for Elian Gonzalez to not be returned to Cuba. He was involved in an incident where a bunch of protesters were really sort of harassing Cuban diplomats in Washington. But Claver-Carone, he's the co-founder of a PAC called the US-Cuba Democracy PAC, which is a donation vehicle for House and Senate members. It was founded in 2003 to, quote, promote an unconditional transition in Cuba to democracy, the rule of law, and the free market. The US-Cuba Democracy PAC raised about $1.5 million between 2003 and 2007, most of it in South Florida, to lobby Congress to keep the sanctions against Cuba in place. The PAC also gave out $400,000 in campaign contributions in 2012 to Ted Cruz, John Boehner, and Mitch McConnell. And it contributed heavily to Marco Rubio's Senate campaign since 2016. So these are the sort of host of characters that Claver-Carone has been involved with and involved with supporting. Claver-Carone also led the nonprofit group Cuba Democracy Advocates from 2004 to 2017. He ran a small lobbying firm called Cuba Democracy Public Advocacy Corp for about 10 years. And while he was involved in these like Washington NGOs, he was really raking it in. He was making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year doing this kind of stuff. He also ran a blog called Capitol Hill Cubans, which is not on the internet anymore, but I did look at it through the Wayback Machine, and it's just sort of your typical anti-Cuba stuff, taking any sort of stories, like even like anti-Cuba stories from like the Associated Press or like with the Washington Post. If there's any sort of hint of something that could be construed as a positive depiction of the Cuban government or Cuban society, this blog was responsible basically for just throwing a bunch of propaganda at it. Like one of the things I saw was that he was going off about how the Castro brothers are basically hotel tycoons and are making billions of dollars off hotels while the people in Cuba are starving, which of course is ridiculous. He was also the host of a Sirius XM radio show called From Washington El Mundo. I haven't listened to that, but I think you can imagine what listening to that is like. So he became a Treasury Department official during the first Trump administration. He then served as acting U.S. executive director to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And I think we are all pretty aware of the IMF's role in imperialism through loans that sort of take grab of countries' economies and take out and privatize resources and force austerity, push down wages, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and that's the context. That's the context when he says very creative. You know, you can think how creative the IMF has been.
Yeah, well, it's interesting in that interview too. Just going back to the original interview we talked about in Politico, he talks about non-imperialist expansion, which is it's very interesting wording. Like this guy, he's a wordsmith to say the least, and we'll get into a little bit more of that later. But he's really good at twisting terms, like just like he said, not regime change, democratic change. But yeah, he's a ridiculous person, but also very powerful and scary. So then after his stint with the IMF, he became National Security Council's senior director for Western Hemisphere, back on Trump's team. Then he was central to the policy of supporting Juan Guaido in Venezuela, because, he and others like him in Washington, they see Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela as all tied together, right? The troika of tyranny that sort of need to be dismantled in order for U.S. finance to just completely take over Latin America. So then in 2019, he was promoted to become a deputy assistant to the president. And in this role, he became credited for creating the U.S. government's maximum pressure campaign against Maduro's regime, or Maduro's government, and for conceptualizing the America Crece economic growth strategy and frameworks, which is just a way for U.S. capital to subvert any sort of government oversight, or to go around any sort of trade regulations there might be, in order to get U.S. capital directly involved in funding projects in Latin America, and basically trying to take over Latin American economy and infrastructure projects and things of that nature. Claver-Carone left the Trump administration for a post at the Inter-American Development Bank. The Inter-American Development Bank is basically just the funding arm of the OAS, the Organization of American States, and they're basically just an IMF that's focused on the Americas. And this bank was also exposed as supporting financially the opposition in Venezuela, supporting Guaido and that sort of attempt at the coup of Maduro in Venezuela. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, if you go back far enough, this Inter-American Bank was also involved in the coup on Allende by funding the opposition forces and also starving Chile of credit when Allende was in power. Mm. And this bank has all sorts of connections to, all the farthest right-wing governments in Latin America now. It's been very involved in Ecuador and Argentina, and all sorts of austerity, austerity policies and policies that are causing inflation and pushing wages down in Latin America. But Claver-Carone was actually fired from the Inter-American Development Bank after allegations emerged that he was in a romantic relationship with a subordinate whose salary he had increased by $133,000 a year. So, yeah. So he's a stand-up guy. Yeah. More recently, in his new position as the special envoy to Latin America, he was traveling with Marco Rubio in Marco Rubio's recent trip around Latin America. So he's becoming very involved in these attempts to overthrow these leftist governments in Latin America. And we were talking earlier about his sort of knack for phraseology and his turn of phrase. Well, he used to write fairly often for the Huffington Post, and in those articles, for one, I read an article of his where he compared the treatment of Cubans in Cuba to the Jews in the Holocaust.
Jesus Christ.
And said that, and this is a quote from that article, he says, most importantly, our diasporas, speaking of the Cuban diaspora and the Jewish diaspora, our diasporas share an unwavering devotion to freedom, democracy, and the moral resolve of, quote, never again. So I don't understand how that, there wasn't a huge outcry at that disgusting comparison.
Oh my God.
Well, that's just abusive of history. That's tantamount to Holocaust denial.
Yeah, absolutely it is. He also said that people in Washington who are uneasy with the term regime change should get over it, and if they prefer, instead of regime change, they can just call it regime choice.
But we're going to choose for you.
Yeah, exactly.
The free market in regimes.
Yeah, the free market of regimes, yeah. So yeah, I mean, this guy has a pretty deep history. I'd never heard of him, to be honest, until the Politico article dropped, but he has a pretty deep and disturbing history in Washington and Florida for his anti-Cuba activities. So it's going to be quite a ride.
It sounds like he has quite a lot of experience and probably pretty in-depth understanding of the region and these economies as well, which makes him all that more dangerous, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he's a veteran of all of these neo-colonial ministries, and he's interacted with so many governments in these different capacities. I'm sure that when he promises creativity, he has a vast repertoire in mind. I read a Washington Post interview with a former Chavez security chief who turned on Maduro and was involved in the U.S. plot to install Guaido. But according to this guy, Claver-Carone's nickname during that operation was the Child Eater.
Holy shit.
So, I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. It's in the Washington Post, and I forget the name of the security chief, but he's detailing the plan to turn the National Assembly against Maduro and so on, and he's itemizing the nicknames of the major players, and he says that Maury's name was the Child Eater.
Oh my God.
Maury the Child Eater.
I wonder, where's that coming from? But yeah, that's okay.
Wait till the QAnons get a hold of that, eh?
He can't make it up. I mean, and this is his. Who knows who originated that? I can only imagine that's his own little moment of poetic inspiration.
He's call me the Child.
Well, yeah, and then just last week, February 7th, was the reintroduction of the DEMOCRACIA Act. So it was Senator Rick Scott, who's a Florida senator, as well as Senator Tommy Tuberville. They introduced this act, and basically it's a maximal pressure, kind of just piling on more sanctions and more pressure against the Cuban people. So the stated purpose, or how they have the short name for the act and then the longer detailed name. So they say it's the Denying Earnings to the Military Oligarchy in Cuba and Restricting Activities of the Cuban Intelligence Apparatus Act.
Whew, that's a mouthful.
Yeah. A lot of these acts are, but this is definitely a long one. So, they say it's to put more pressure on the Cuban government They want to put unprecedented financial pressure on the Cuban government, and they claim that Cuba is the root of instability in Latin America and is a constant threat to the national security of the United States, and that they've been emboldened in the past 4 years by the Biden-Harris appeasement policies. I have no idea what appeasement policies they could possibly be speaking of, because Biden and Harris sat on their hands for 4 years when it came to Cuba and didn't follow through any of their promises, really.
Yeah.
I mean, that's BS. Saying it's an illegitimate government. Diaz-Canel's illegitimate, even though he was elected. Of course, yes, they have a different electoral system in Cuba. Many countries have different variations of democracy, and Cuba's is a lot more participatory. But in terms of national security threats, they're saying, Cuba's interfering in Latin America. They're hosting a Chinese spy station, which is also just one of those made-up stories. Again, there's not a shred of proof that this is true, but they keep saying it over and over again. And I believe even some in the U.S. intelligence agency even said it's not true, that there's no Chinese spy station in Cuba. So the intelligence, the CIA, themselves said this isn't true, or we don't have evidence of this. This is not true. So it's not a fact, but they're saying it. And so the thing about this act is that it's so much more broad in who it's going to sanction in Cuba. I'd say broad and deep, because it's targeting individuals, any individual in Cuba that is a member of the Communist Party of Cuba, that worked for the Ministry of Justice in Cuba, any member of the committees for the defense of the revolution, which are in every neighborhood in Cuba. Oh, of course, the Army, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Cuba, the Office of the President of Cuba, the Council of State, and the Council of Ministers. They're sanctioning the entire government at all levels. And it also trickles down to the family members of any of these individuals. So their spouse and their children will also be blocked individuals, as they call them, or subject to these sanctions. To me, it sounds like they're sanctioning the vast majority of Cuban people with this act, because most Cuban people participate in their local committee for defense of the revolution. They're a Communist Party member. This is common. Like they can make a case that like 3/4 of the Cuban population could have these sanctions applied to them. So
it's interesting though, like when I was reading a lot of stuff about Claver-Carone, like one of the things he repeats quite often too is that it's not the people in government who are suffering from the sanctions and the blockade, but it's the Cuban people. Now I am totally against that sort of separation that right-wing people want to make between the government and the people in Cuba. But even just admitting that, he's admitting that these sanctions and blockades are completely directed at the people of Cuba, like the everyday people. Mm-hmm. And we know this, right, from like the Mallory memo, where they say that the point is to put pressure on the people so they like rise up and overthrow their government. But it's interesting with this act from Rick Scott, and from what we're hearing from Claver-Carone, they're basically just saying it out right now that we are targeting the people of Cuba. Yeah,
it's we want change and we're going to force it to happen. Basically, they're not. Yeah. Nobody's denying it anymore, that it is meant to make things completely unbearable for the Cuban people. And yeah, I agree. It's not correct in Cuba. It doesn't represent Cuba and their system to separate the people from their government. The sanctions affect everybody, government or not. It doesn't matter. And then back to this act too, the other thing about it is it makes it nearly impossible, if this were to pass, for any future president to terminate the sanctions. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but if any president wanted to, up to this point, it could be an executive order to remove the blockade.
I don't want to repeat the line that very many ineffective executives have hidden behind. But my understanding is that it would now take Congress.
Okay.
That's what Obama said.
Okay. So with this new act that's being proposed, the president would have to certify to Congress that the government of Cuba legalizes all political parties in Cuba, establishes a free press, releases all political prisoners, and holds free, fair, multi-party, internationally observed elections in a timely manner. It's worth noting right now that in Cuba, there are no parties that participate at all in elections. But we know what they want here, and we know why they want this liberal form of, quote unquote democracy. So all of those conditions would have to be met for any president to remove the sanctions. Also, this bill authorizes the President of the United States to use all means possible to provide unrestricted, reliable internet to the people of Cuba, so that Cubans aren't censored or blocked by the Cuban regime. This is a crock of shit because most of the censorship or lack of available internet connectivity is due to the US blockade. I can't remember how many years ago it was now. It could have been during the last Trump administration that Google, now Alphabet, were planning to build an undersea cable to connect to Cuba. And that would have drastically improved their connectivity, their internet connectivity. They were told to cancel that project, so it never went through. The United States, they don't want Cubans to have good internet access, good reliable internet access. They're happy that the lack of connectivity affects not just social life, but productivity and work. It affects the government, it affects the banks, every sector, obviously. We use the internet for practically everything, and you need that. So, in a lot of countries, a lot of tourist countries, people will travel, from Canada or the US. They'll go on vacation, but maybe they'll go for more than a week or more than 2 weeks because they can work while they're away too. So they can go for longer and spend more time in that country. And as long as they've got an internet connection, they're all good. They can work remotely if they have that type of job. People can't even do that in Cuba. Like, it's really hard for anybody to, not just for Cubans in Cuba, it's for anybody visiting Cuba. It's really hard to get a reliable connection. I tried to connect last time I was in Cuba, I tried to get some work done. It was doing a test, really. I wanted to see how the connection was. And I couldn't even connect to the internet because my VPN, the VPN that we use just to log into my work laptop, not my internet, to log into my computer, my VPN, it was blocked, not by the Cuban government, by the United States. The VPN that we use is owned by Cisco, which is a huge tech company in the United States, and they comply with sanctions. And with Cuba being on the SSOT list, they don't provide service while within Cuba, and probably like the DPRK and Syria at the time and a handful of others. So it's the US that's blocking Cubans' access to internet or anybody's access to internet in Cuba. So they don't care about reliable, unrestricted internet access. All of these apps and websites are blocked to Cubans from the US. It's not the Cuban government. The Cuban government actually barely blocks anything. I did some research like 2 years ago on this. The United States censors way more than Cuba does when it comes to internet. So what they really want to do is they want some kind of internet that they can have control over, and they want to target the population with propaganda and just subvert the Cuban government that way. So that's what that's all about. This DEMOCRACIA Act is just tightening the blockade further under a bunch of BS justifications and the typical lies that they always tell. They're just repeating the same talking points that they always do. It's still bad. It's still really, really bad if this does go through. It's only going to make things difficult. I just saw the other day that Western Union, once again, is not operating in Cuba. So that's one less option for people to send money to their families or friends in Cuba. Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me when I was reading this bill from Senator Rick Scott, and I don't know if I've missed this or maybe I've blocked it from my memory, but I don't recall like, obviously there's this attempt to try to make Cuba seem like a threat to the United States, which is like completely ridiculous, right? Like that a country of 11 million people would be any sort of threat to like U.S. security. It's completely ridiculous. But in order to like bolster this claim, this bill says, quote, the Cuban regime props up ruthless dictators and allows a foothold in Latin America for Russia, Iran, and the Communist Party of China. What regime are the Cubans propping up? Like it's this weird, contradiction that exists in these right-wingers' mind where, Cuba's on the one hand about to collapse at any second, and also on the other hand, it's able to prop up, I guess, Iran, Russia, and China. Like China, they're like by some measures, the biggest economy in the world. Like what are they trying to pull? Like it's so crazy.
Yeah, it's such a stretch. This is like clown talk. Like when I read it, I'm just like, I just shake my head that they even say these things.
I said it was kettle logic, but it's also sort of like a paradigmatic structure, I think, of reactionary fantasy, where the population that you're scapegoating is simultaneously in control of the whole planet, and the lowest. They're the lowest and the highest, and this is duplicated at every level. Like what Rob was talking about, the irony when you were describing the criminalization of the committees in defense of the revolution, Samantha. The irony is that the effectivity of these personal sanctions actually presumes a relatively full level of participation of the total citizenry in the revolution that's being sanctioned.
Totally.
So they're saying, the revolution is unpopular and we want to hasten its dispatch by supporting all of these dissidents in Cuba, but then the means by which they intend to topple the revolution actually presumes that it's penetrated every sphere of civic life. And it can't be both, right?
Yeah, that's such a good point. They're so incompetent. They're so on the brink of collapse. The government is so unpopular. But at the same time, they're so savvy and their power is so outsized in the region, and they're so dangerous and they're a threat to national security. Yeah, exactly. Which one is it? Yeah.
Exxon knows along the way. It's nice to hear somebody say, thanks for coming by today. Exxon wants you here.
Also in recent news, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has pivoted to support the suit of ExxonMobil suing Cuba for confiscated properties. I'm trying to figure out why they've made that turn, why they've gone that way, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. But Cam, I think you might have a little bit more information if you wanna go on this a little bit, this ExxonMobil suit.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to figure this out because I think it's going to become increasingly important to annotate these sort of intra-class fractures and some of the surprising developments within the U.S. bourgeoisie. Certainly, the Chamber of Commerce had previously opposed Title III of the Helms-Burton Act as something that was overzealous, either redundant of existing legislation or even opening U.S. companies up to countersuits from abroad. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce had been quite clear about this. For those listening who aren't familiar, Title III of the Helms-Burton Act permits so-called, I suppose, Cuban exiles who are U.S. nationals, as well as companies expropriated during the course of the revolution, to sue for property rights and lost revenues and so on. This has been a very contentious piece of legislation from the start. It was passed in 1996. It was signed by Clinton. It was initiated, I think, by Jesse Helms. It was initiated by Republicans. And again, I think you can use the Helms-Burton Act and its uneven implementation to understand how the blockade really is a bipartisan offensive. We're talking today about how the Trump administration and its cronies, child eaters, right, are in a real way the worst case scenario for Cuba. And I think that there are all kinds of explicable reasons why that's the case. But the Helms-Burton Act, it was Republican-initiated legislation that Clinton apparently thought was too much at the time, but he signed it anyway. And there's a lot of speculation as to why. It was an election year. You have this powerful Floridian factor. And rather than veto, he set the precedent that held strong until Trump, which is that he signed the act but suspended Title III of the act. And every president since Clinton and until Trump suspended Title III, permitting these lawsuits in 6-month intervals. You see the tremendous weakness even of the Democrats who are, nominally more kind to Cuba. I wouldn't make too much out of that. I'll digress for a second. I was always surprised at how kindly disposed Fidel was toward Kennedy in his recollections of the era, where he basically repeats that Kennedy was a fine statesman whose hand was forced by having inherited Eisenhower directives. And that's wild when you look at that era, right? Playa Girón, the October Crisis. Operation Mongoose, though, was, again, designed by Eisenhower and rolled out by Kennedy. So you see this really, really good continuity.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, there's this waffling. So ExxonMobil was involved in a Title III suit, and stop me if I'm incorrect, that was blocked by a DC Circuit Court. They ruled against Exxon.
Yeah.
And they were suing. They were suing a number of. Cuban state
entities
owned enterprises, but I like the only one I can remember right now is Cemex, which is a petroleum company. When Trump declined to suspend Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, Exxon jumped at the opportunity. So did many other capitals. There were more lawsuits, mostly against hotels, I believe.
Yeah, the Melia chain, yeah.
Yeah. And Exxon jumped at the opportunity. Now, a DC Circuit Court ruled in favor of Cemex. They found that Exxon actually was not entitled. And at the time, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce reaffirmed its historic record of opposing the Helms-Burton Act Title III legislation. More recently, they've pivoted. It's hard to know what's going on in the background here, but if you do some digging, I think you can find a kind of realignment of some of the more mercenary factors of the GOP and the MAGA coalition. Rodney Davis is the head of governmental affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce right now. When he was Republican representative for Illinois, he had an interesting relationship to Cuba. He voted against a travel ban in 2016 during the Obama thaw. He very explicitly saw himself as, in addition to being a pro-labor Republican, he thought that he was a reasonably progressive Republican where Cuba is concerned. He went to Cuba in 2015 on a trip with the Illinois-Cuba Working Group. So this is a Midwestern agribusiness lobby representing farmers exporting soybeans and chicken and so on to Cuba since 2013. So this is an interesting B-plot too. They affiliate to the U.S. Agriculture Coalition for Cuba. And it's worth looking into this organization to understand how some Chamber of Commerce wonks and some Republican representatives wind up sounding more progressive on Cuba than Democrats. Since 2000, there's been a loophole in the blockade by which U.S. food producers can sell to Cuba. And this has opened on to a lot of lobbying by a totally apolitical agribusiness front. They want an easing of restrictions so that they can offer credit to Cuba, which under present conditions is not the case. Cuba, as we've discussed, has to pay up front in cash for what they're able to import. So this group still uses pretty suspicious language in its otherwise very interesting briefs. They see new markets emerging from local development projects since 2008, and they want to break apart government regulation and break apart the ministries that decide upon Cuban agriculture. So they're against the blockade in many respects, but in a very self-interested way.
Yeah.
And the Agriculture Coalition has a lot of members in Michigan and Missouri and Kansas and lots of geographies where farmers and ranchers are seeking to open up new markets as they're squeezed by monopolies at home. So this is I think super interesting. But these are the same lobbies that are furious with Trump over the proposed tariffs right now, because Canada and Mexico and China are their top 3 markets, and they're concerned with retaliation. So it's convoluted stuff. But Rodney Davis went to Cuba with these Illinois farmers in a year that saw a 63% decrease in their exports to Cuba. And he kept a blog at the time, which is how I know this. I don't keep very close tabs on Illinois representatives, but he wrote about it for his blog. He was touring Cuban farms, and similarly to Obama, he was repeating, that free trade with Cuba is quote, the only way we can boost the middle class and rid the Cuban people of the oppressive Castro regime. So politically poor, no friend of Cuba, but very much in favor of the Obama-era turn because he was speaking on behalf of this agricultural lobby. They were his constituents. So Davis is the guy who now is specifically tasked with rapprochement between the Chamber of Commerce and Trump Republicans. And I think that we can see these divergent class interests and these splits within the U.S. bourgeoisie where the Chamber of Commerce is concerned, right? There's a lot of writing on this, but they've kind of pivoted to the Democrats as the GOP trends protectionist. They've historically been very much against tariffs, and they've refreshed this feud as recently as last week in a very strong statement against Trump's tariffs, saying that it's going to cause economic harm to Main Street and so on, the usual tropes. So Davis is pretty quiet about this, and he cuts this weird figure because he's this non-Trump Republican who was sidelined in the MAGA coalition, but he's since pivoted to Trumpism and united behind the president, as so many others have. So we have this Trump-friendly head at the Chamber of Commerce now who is on his knees, basically. And the chamber was drifting out of sync with MAGA over these proposed trade wars. And there's a lot of commentary about how Davis is the guy who's specifically tasked with repairing this rift. It's a pronounced change of position, In 2019, the Chamber of Commerce was strongly against Title III, far more worried about countersuits against American companies. But there are these weird cleaves in the GOP and people switching sides by the day. So Davis attributes his own about-face to the populist tenor of MAGA. This pro-labor Republican. He says that Trump is becoming one. But I look at this and I can only see his own lobbying interests drifting into contradiction with this new office where he basically has to piece together a Trump-friendly Chamber of Commerce. And right now there's nothing but contradiction.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One thing I think we should mention too, because it's not something that I have heard very often, but we should mention the reason. So with these expropriated companies and these properties that were nationalized after the revolution in Cuba, the government of Cuba settled with companies from all other parts of the world, European companies, Spanish companies, even Canadian companies. The settlements were made. There was compensation given after these companies and properties were expropriated. It was only these American corporations that did not come to a settlement, and it's not because the Cuban government was not willing to compensate them. When the Cuban government was offering compensation, they let these corporations know. So revenue underreporting was like rampant before the revolution. It was everything was very corrupt in Cuba up until that point. So it was pretty much the norm for these companies to underreport their revenue, and therefore they were underpaying in taxes. They weren't paying as much tax as they should have been. They're ripping off the working class of Cuba, basically. So then comes the revolution, and the properties are expropriated by the Cuban government. Mm-hmm. When the Cuban government's looking at these settlement offers, they're looking at the books and they're saying, well, this is what you valued your company at, so this is the compensation that you're entitled to. And then of course, there was they would be like in an uproar about that because, well, no, the corporation's worth this much more. They basically exposed themselves that they were undervaluing their companies on purpose to avoid paying taxes. So the Cuban government was like, well, we'll either pay you based on the value that you said your company was worth and the revenues that you said that you were making at that time, or we can pay you the full valuation of your corporation, but you also have to pay back all of those taxes. Neither of which any of them wanted to agree to. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah, it wasn't the move to expropriate a lot of these businesses, and like specifically like the oil companies' property, like came after the U.S. was giving direction to U.S.-owned oil refineries not to refine oil that Cuba was getting from the Soviet Union. And so they basically forced the Cuban government's hand on this issue.
Yeah, oil, I know for sure. You're right. That wasn't immediately expropriated. It was expropriated in a reaction to this hostile direction from the U.S. government, to tell those companies to halt the refining of oil in Cuba, which obviously would have been devastating for Cuba. But I'm pretty sure before that happened, there were other properties. Land was expropriated. All that agriculture, a lot of the factories and things, things happened. There was a sequence, but definitely you're right about the oil. That wasn't immediate. That decision was taken after they didn't really have a choice, because the still American-owned oil company wasn't going to play ball and refine the oil. They weren't going to continue doing that. So Cuba was within its rights as a sovereign country that had been colonized to expropriate that at that point. The Cuban government never refused to compensate any of these companies. That's not what this is about. It's about these corporations under working with the U.S. government, deciding not to settle so they could pursue regime change and try to overthrow the Cuban government, which they thought was going to be very, very easy. And to their surprise, it hasn't been.
I think it's also like with it, talking about the question of appropriation or expropriation in Cuba, I think it's always like, I always like to bring up like the 1974 resolution adopted by the United Nations on the declaration of the establishment of a new international economic order, where it says that it's the full inalienable right of any sovereign nation to protect its own resources and take control over them and their exploitation with means suitable to its own situation, including the right to nationalization or transfer of ownership to its nationals. This right being expressed of the full permanent sovereignty of the state. No state may be subjected to economic, political, or any other type of coercion to prevent the free and full exercise of this inalienable right. So, I mean, obviously the United States doesn't give a shit about what the United Nations says, but this just goes to show you that, like, the international community, like in international law, what Cuba did by expropriating those properties is their right to do.
This is what, what is it, Mali? It's one of the three countries in the, one of the Sahel states. They've nationalized their minerals and their gold, right? And the Canadian mining industry was huge over there, and they've expropriated that now. Our government they're not happy about it. Obviously their interests are the same interests as our mining corporations, and they really don't obviously respect the right to those countries to have full control over their own resources, and we'll see how things are going to go, but they're talking trash about these countries and these governments who are finally have been able to stand up and take control of their land and their countries, and which is within their rights under legal international law. But colonial imperialist countries don't respect those laws, and that's not within their interests. So that's just something more recently that just made me think of, right? Because it's happening there,
it's
and we'll
ongoing.
see how. Yeah, it's still ongoing, and we'll see how our country and the U.S. Continue to react to those developments. But
So, as we've now brushed on the topic of colonial meddling in Mali, maybe we can talk about USAID. One of the Trump administration's controversial moves this week, the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, I think, has slashed funding to USAID. And this has caused some heads to spin because of what USAID has practically meant for so many underdeveloped countries. It's an odd moment of consilience where Diaz-Canel correctly notes that USAID was intended for purposes of political subversion, and Cubans have been on the receiving end of its efforts at soft power and regime change for many years. So what do we make of this defunding?
to me, what it looks like to me is that they've got to make it look like they're going to save a bunch of money. They're trying to make it look like to the American people that they're going to cut all these expenses, and that because you notice a lot I find it on the right, they really hate obviously they hate money being spent in foreign countries to quote unquote help or provide aid. It's like help our own at home. Most of those people don't give a shit about people at home either. But, it's about not spending money on these other countries. But the thing is, what most of the American population, Canadians too, don't know or realize is that these funds are not largely used. It's not for material aid or to help with development. That's the guise. It's under that guise, but most of it is to promote neoliberalization of those economies through programs, and also subversion, political subversion, funding propaganda outlets, quote unquote independent journalists in other countries, NGOs, even like political organizations and political parties in other countries. For example, there was one called Cuba Decide that was very involved in July 11th in 2021 in Cuba in those protests. They had some beautiful signs and placards that they had made. They must have shipped them, or someone brought them down from Florida or something, because Cubans would make their own goddamn signs, like, if you know what I mean. But that's what USAID. Like you said, it's soft power, and it's one of these arm's length agencies from the CIA. It's doing the work that the CIA used to do. Now they're making it appear like they're going to stop. They're shutting down USAID or USAID, whatever you want to call it. But I'm 99.9% sure that they're just sharpening the sword. They're gonna create another agency or name it something else, or it'll be more secretive. It will be even less accountable to the American people. People won't know where this money is going, because up until a couple months ago, you could see whether it was the National Endowment for Democracy, that's another one, or USAID. You could see on their websites all of the NGOs and journalists and publications that receive public funds. They're giving these grants, right? So there's, and all this stuff, some of it was, you could see on their website, but I guess some of it was kind of confidential, because now it seems pretty scandalous that all these names of people and quote unquote independent journalists that now we always knew they weren't independent, but now it's out there. You can literally see the salaries that some of these people were drawing. There's people making way up high in the six-figure salaries because they were the CEO of like whatever, digital news, whatever. What I make of it is they're not going to stop doing these things. They're just going to do it in a different way. But it's just optics, I feel. It's just optics.
It's just like taking away any transparency, right? It's like, like it seems like they're doing this good thing, saving money, becoming more efficient. But yeah, like you said, Samantha, it's just going to become more covert and harder to track.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the USAID thing is one of these. It's funny incidental outcomes of the art of the deal in office, which I think you correctly characterize as, I mean, it's just slashing. And I think Trump has little taste for soft power. That's what people like Robert O'Brien claim on behalf of his foreign policy too, right? Which isn't so quietly interventionist, but directly threatening. Jingoism in its most brutal form, somebody said. But I, on one hand, I think that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, because it seems like this extravagant expense to Trump now, but USAID funneled $700 million to the Venezuelan opposition during the Guaido debacle, which is signature policy of the first Trump administration, right? So it's all terribly confusing, but I think a lot of this downsizing by way of Doge, I shudder to say it, is as you say, neoliberalism perfected. Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about anti-state statism, which is the right's ploy to consolidate state power by gutting state apparatuses on a preferential basis. So USAID goes the way of the U.S. contribution to the WHO, and I think it's just difficult when we're looking at a mature imperialist state, such as the U.S., to cleanly separate its functions out from one another, because Trump is definitely not attacking USAID because of what it does, which he wishes to do by other means, I agree. It just looks like a large expenditure without any obvious return. And that's probably how he sees all kinds of life-sustaining state expenditures too, like housing and climate-related budget lines and grants to First Nations as identical fonts of leeching and corruption. So it's one of these sort of incidentally acceptable developments by a certain standard, but I think it's part and parcel to a really frightening program.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see like what sort of effect this actually has on these like anti-Cuban online blogs and websites, because I could see how they may not seem effective, but I bet they are pretty effective, because if you want to search anything about Cuba, anything that's going on in Cuba, and you Google it, like a lot of, first you'll get the NBC and the CBS and the CNN and all this, but then you'll start to get like the Havana Times or like Cyber Cuba, these websites that, look like they're authentic, look like they're written by people in Cuba or written by Cubans who just want to give the Cuban perspective on the ground, that are sort of subverting the regime's like control of information. And it looks really authentic. And it looks like, even to people on the left, it can look like, oh, these, this is the righteous struggle. But to actually dig and find out what's really going on, you have to sort of wade through all these like USAID and other, government funded sites that just want to lead you in the wrong direction.
And it's effective. Like the information warfare is very effective. And like there's so many of these publications and outlets online. And people just don't have a clue. They think, oh, it's Cuba news.
Yeah.
Cuba Noticias, Diario de Cuba, ADN Cuba, El Toque.
Yeah.
There's a baseball show called Swing Completo on YouTube. Radio Marti.
That's such an offensive misnomer.
Oh,
right?
man.
Yeah, the right wing of the exile community and the counter-revolutionaries, they love to co-opt Jose Marti. It's just so disgusting. Also, we didn't mention the, under the Obama administration, USAID funded Zunzuneo, which was a Cuban version of Twitter in like 2009. So that was when like real Twitter was like gaining a lot of popularity at the time. So then they created this like version, and a lot of people, a lot of Cubans downloaded it or were using it on their computer, and they didn't have a clue. And then, you know, civic programs in Cuba and health programs that were funded by USAID that were really used for infiltration and inciting unrest. You know, having meetings, you know, HIV prevention workshops with local people, but then at the same time trying to organize them, you know, against their own government. Like, it's just really sick, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
And you know, maybe one more thing I want to add on a slight tangent, but to tie this together, because I think we began by really enumerating the operators of the present Trump offensive against Cuba, is that I should really like to dissuade, as we're talking about the insidious effects of US aid, I should really like to dissuade some of the optimism of Trump's supposed protectionism that I've seen in anti-imperialist, quote unquote, quarters, you know? The incidental good of this decision reminds me of some seriously flawed argumentation in one of the weirdest newsletters I read. There's this newsletter by Charles McKelvey, and he writes about Cuba and is a friend of Cuba on its own terms, but he's ardently pro-MAGA. And even in the last 2 weeks, he's arguing that Trump's Cuba policy is unclear and we shouldn't judge. He says that Trump's isolationism, and like, tell that to the people of Gaza, right? It's not really an isolationist foreign policy at all. It's annexationist, it's belligerent, but whatever. He says that Trump's isolationism bodes well for Cuban sovereignty. And he thinks, and it's so strange because he pays close attention, but he thinks that the state sponsors of terrorism list is just a tug of war between incoming and outgoing administrations. And he thinks that maybe Trump doesn't really need right-wing Floridians as he once did. And he's looking for these signs of optimism. But as the Trump administration escalates against Cuba, he's backed into this corner where he has to argue, for example, that Rubio is not representative of, but is betraying MAGA, where MAGA is this isolationist plan to reindustrialize the United States, and Trump isn't interested in these costly efforts to destabilize Cuba or Venezuela. And it's not really worth wasting time on the misperception of MAGA as like an authentically workerist movement. But I think if we're talking about USAID, we need to refute these errors too and really carefully attend to the intra-class contradictions that compose bourgeois politics in the imperial core.
El día primero aquel, lleno de emoción y ruido, alguien dijo conmovido y feliz, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite.